Hey everybody, welcome to other games that annoy me to no end. This is not quite the same as Infuriation, obviously, but it's also not quite as bad as the games that depress me to no end I did on Fallout 76. This is Recon Breakpoint, for which I have officially hit my breaking point of giving a crap about finishing the game thanks to Ubisoft's recent announcement that they are doing Ubisoft Quartz, which is apparently some sort of NFT scheme that they are shoving into the game, because they seem to think that's a good idea. And since I am incredibly fucking tired of seeing NFT this, NFT that, whether it be people talking about how much NFTs are clearly a scam, or whether they're talking about how they're the future, all that kind of bullshit, I just finally hit the point where I said, you know what, it's really not worth finishing Breakpoint, because I put about 6 hours into the game, and I wasn't having any fun, and it wasn't looking like it was going to get any better. Now, of course, that wasn't exactly surprising after my experience with Ghost Recon Wildlands, which was an absolute mess. I ended up giving that game a 1 out of 5. So I wasn't exactly optimistic going into Breakpoint, especially because it's a looter shooter, even though technically now you can turn that component of the game off. I don't know what the hell it is about Ubisoft and their obsession with homogenizing every single one of their franchises into one general Ubisoft game that is just bland and uninteresting, but Breakpoint was really no exception in that regard, and right off the bat, I really wasn't having any fun with it. I will give it this, it runs a lot better than Wildlands did. Wildlands did not run very well, but Breakpoint actually runs pretty decently, so at least they improved the engine. And it does look a bit better than Wildlands did, so kudos to that as well. And I will also give Ubisoft this. They have more or less stuck with the game and put out updates for it. They've overhauled some of the mechanics and introduced a mode where you can turn off all the looter-shooter mechanics and turn it more into what Wildlands was, which I guess was a tactical third-person shooter, but it was extremely bare-bones in that regard. Although that immersive mode is really only available in the single player, and I believe co-op as well, although I haven't had a chance to test out the co-op firsthand, because I'm pretty sure I'm the only person I know who actually has a copy of this game. Meanwhile, if you want to go into online PvP, then you have to turn on the looter-shooter mechanics, so I just didn't go into online PvP. Anyway, point is that the game is certainly in a better state than it was at launch, and Ubisoft does deserve credit for making what improvements they did. The problem is that it's still Ghost Recon Breakpoint. And I'm not entirely sure what Ubisoft was thinking with this game, because it's like they tried to blend a bunch of elements from all of their other franchises into a Ghost Recon game, and it just doesn't work. Because think about where this series came from. The original Ghost Recon was a first-person tactical shooter in the vein of Rainbow Six, but on a larger, more military scale. Then they reduced the scale and the tactical options for the subsequent games, Ghost Recon 2 and of course Advanced Warfighter 1 and 2, but they were all still clearly tactical shooters through and through. Then you get to Future Soldier, and even though it was kind of a mess, it was still clearly a tactical shooter, at least to some degree. Then Wildlands happened, and they had decided to take it in a co-op direction and also open world, because open world is just something they seem to think is going to work with apparently anything, and that's not really the case. Open-ended? Sure, most of the Ghost Recon series has had some degree of open-ended design, but open world, no, and it doesn't really work all that well in Ghost Recon Wildlands. And then we finally get to Breakpoint, and they decided to take the gameplay design of Wildlands and shoehorn in a bunch of looter-shooter mechanics and more RPG-style mechanics, but also shove in more of a crafting system and some very light survival elements, but then also throw you up against giant robot tanks, which you need to deal with using conventional small arms, because that makes sense. And sure, Tom Clancy is probably spinning so fast in his grave at this point that you could power the entire world with the energy he's producing. But hey, Breakpoint's got John Bernthal in it, so clearly that counts for so much. Never mind, I guess, that what story does exist in the game is so bare bones that it's basically impossible to give a single solitary crap about anything that's going on in it, or that the actual mission structure in this game is basically exactly the same as it was in Wildlands, where you just spend most of your time venturing from point A to point B, and when you get to point B, you're going to interact with maybe one or two things and maybe shoot a few dudes, and that's about it. They tried to expand the clue-finding stuff that you had in Wildlands into investigations in this, but the investigations are just a slightly more tedious version of what you saw in Wildlands, so it really doesn't add anything worthwhile. And then once you actually get into the combat itself, it's basically like it was in Wildlands, except that if you have the looter-shooter mechanics on, then enemies will become absolute bullet sponges, except if you shoot them in the head, in which case it's an instant kill. Obviously, that doesn't have any effect on the mechanoid tanks or the drones, though. They're still bullet sponges no matter what you do, so you just have to deal with that in some regard. So you have this really weird dichotomy where when you're fighting the human enemies, they're all dumber than a sack of hammers, and so are your AI squad mates for that matter, but that's beside the point. And so they are all laughably easy to take down, considering all you need to do is score a single headshot and they just drop like a sack of potatoes. But then you'll run across a behemoth on your way to a different area, or you might need to fight one in order to get a blueprint or something like that. And not only is it a long and tedious fight because the thing's just a giant bullet sponge and takes forever to bring down, but because the friendly AI is so incredibly stupid, you cannot rely on them in order to be able to take the thing down, so you basically have to go into these fights in co-op. Because much like Wildlands, they designed the entire game around being 4-player co-op and didn't even really give a single solitary crap about anybody who was playing it in single player. They had to patch in the AI squad mates, and they also much later on patched in some changes to the AI squad mates to where they now will level up and gain access to new abilities and such, but that doesn't fix the problem of their AI being so dumb that they are completely unreliable. It still has no real tactical options, so you can't order your squad mates around like you can in a proper tactical shooter. You can just mark targets for being shot at, and that's about it. So about the best you can really hope for with the AI squad mates is that they will take some of the heat off of you, and that's about it. As I mentioned before, they did introduce some light survival elements that really don't add anything to the game. I mean, you need to drink water in order to keep your stamina up, and you get 3 health bars that are basically the same way that Far Cry's health system works, where once you deplete one of the bars, then it will move on to the next one, and then it will automatically regenerate health up to the maximum of the bar you're currently on, and if you want to heal up any further, then you need to spend healing resources to bandage yourself up and such. Does it actually make the game more interesting and exciting or tactical? No, not really. But it also doesn't detract too much from the game either, it just adds some unnecessary tacked-on mechanics. And that really could describe most of the changes they made to Ghost Recon Breakpoint, except that some of them are more destructive than others. I mean, adding the very light survival mechanics of needing to drink water and such, and the changes to the health system don't really impact the game too much, so it's not really something you're going to mind too much. But then there are things like the looter-shooter mechanics, which more or less completely destroy the entire feel of Ghost Recon Breakpoint, even remotely being a proper tactical shooter, and instead make it feel more like it's trying to be The Division, but worse in pretty much every regard. And all the tacked-on crafting mechanics and scavenging and such quickly becomes a very tedious chore. The entire experience of trying to play Ghost Recon Breakpoint ends up dragging you down to this point where you feel like you're playing this soulless focus group designed mess, where it's like they saw a bunch of other games that were popular and decided, you know what, let's just take a bunch of elements from all of those, slap them into this thing, slap the Ghost Recon label on it, throw John Bernthal in there, and call it a day. And as someone who has played those other games that this is taking all of its elements from, I'd rather just play those other games because those other games do those things much better. You can't just take a bunch of elements from a bunch of games, throw them all into a blender, and then hit the puree button. The end result is just going to be something like Ghost Recon Breakpoint, where all of those elements don't really work together with each other, and you end up with a game that is bland and completely soulless, and ultimately just so boring that there's not really any reason to play it at all. It is basically the epitome of a corporate cash grab, and now that they're deciding to put NFTs into the game, that makes it even more painfully obvious. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not the worst game ever made or anything, but like I've said before, and I will say many times hence, I can work with a game being bad, but a game like Ghost Recon Breakpoint is just really, really boring, and you can't do anything with boring. it is just not worth playing. Not when there are so many other options out there that are far better. Hell, I would actually recommend Ghost Recon Wildlands over this, because at least Wildlands has some vague sense of personality. This doesn't even have that. And what annoys me so much about all of this is that there are already so few tactical shooters out there that when you remove one from the playing field, like Ghost Recon Breakpoint has effectively done for the Ghost Recon franchise, you're dragging the entire genre down with you. Now, thankfully, there are a few more smaller-scale, indie-developed tactical shooters, but they're more along the lines of Rainbow Six and the SWAT series and stuff like that, so we're talking stuff like Ready or Not, for example. But as for a bit larger-scale, military-themed stuff, we're really not getting any of those. I think the closest thing we got to that was H-Hour Worlds Elite, which was kind of a take on the SOCOM style of gameplay. And as far as I remember, that was multiplayer only, and it was basically dead on arrival, because it was just such an absolute mess of a game from a technical standpoint, among other things, that people just stopped playing it very quickly. So basically our options at this point, if we want to play a proper tactical shooter that's more of a military theme and plays a bit more like, say, Ghost Recon, well, we're just gonna have to go back and play one of the older Ghost Recon games, because it's very clear at this point Ubisoft is not actually going to take the Ghost Recon series in a tactical direction. They're just gonna keep turning it further and further into the generic Ubisoft mono game that they've basically been developing over the past decade or so, which clearly is a financial success for them, but it makes their games less and less interesting to actually play. So at this point, I think I'm just going to write off the entire Ghost Recon series from here on out, because I really don't see it getting any better. Of course, one of these days I am going to go back and do a redux of the original Ghost Recon and include the expansions in it that time, and I'll certainly be doing videos on all of the games in the series that I haven't done up to this point, but anything developed after Breakpoint, honestly, I really don't care anymore. Such is the unfortunate state of modern video games, especially the AAA game industry, where everything is becoming increasingly homogenous and increasingly less interesting. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand, but the option is there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.